Hi everybody, back again. My talk about a culture of excellence is from a completely different tangent, and just what that means to the people who turn up for work every day and either deliver process or deliver care. So I thought inspiring a culture of excellence in our people was apt. I reckon that that's a pretty true statement still from Aristotle, and we need to be aware that doing something on a Monday doesn't mean it's automatically happening still on Thursday and Friday. So it's a constant investment, and it's a slow burning fuse, if you like. You know, it's getting excellence is really this long thing. I know it's step 10 in the steps, but I reckon it's an overarching step really, and you kind of need to start at step 10 to get all the rest going. So I think it's intrinsically linked to all of them. Oh, can you take me back one? How do we do that? Oh, there you go. So who are our people that make the difference? Well, I could talk about this all day really, to be fair. So there's just a random moulage of people, but that's operations, it's volunteers that make up a lot of people that respond for St. John Ambulance in Western Australia. But up on the top left there is Joe Public, and our first aid training people and the AED and the CFR people put a lot of time and investment in preloading those bases, and getting bystander CPR to a better quality is on the radar. So how did we inspire some of the culture of excellence in our people? Well, fortunately for us, we had some early buy-in from our internal communications people and internal marketing. Very fortunate to be able to sit down with them, and they extracted as non-clinicians what those basic themes and principles of high-performance CPR were that we wanted to instill in people as we started on this journey. So they were at ground level in really early, helping us shape this and how we could market it internally to create that appetite for change and make sure that everybody within the organization had some visibility of what was coming, because I think traditionally a clinical change was limited to clinical people. So this was an organization change as part of that system approach. And we really did create that appetite for change, particularly within our volunteers. And what we did is we talked about cardiac arrest so frequently on different media and mediums that they couldn't wait to be part of this change. So that made delivery of a revised approach to CPR a bit easier for us, because they knew what was coming. They helped us select those principles, as I said, and we were fortunate enough for them to put some money behind getting some good icons going, which you see up in the top right there, which were your good go-to themes that people could remember and hang their hat on without having to read a dot point list every time. So we thought that that was pretty valuable. We've got a lot of people that teach a lot of people first aid every single day, and the bystander and the AED is kind of where the magic's at, in case you've not been paying attention for the last few hours. So our first aid trainers really, really good at teaching CPR and AED awareness, but we've brought them in and said, we really want to tell you a little bit about the science of CPR. We want you to understand why you're teaching what you're teaching, so that when we ask you to get bystanders to maybe do palm-up compressions, why we want that to happen. Because if the quality of the bystander CPR is just that little bit better, the patient is in a bit better nick for us to work on when we have either an AED there or a professional crew. We fed back to them what we're starting to see on CCTV reviews of arrests in places in Western Australia, and what the 000 call is telling us. 5 minutes. That's not fair. And what we're starting to see, delays to people pressing a shock button on an AED. You know, we see that in the data, that a shock is advised, and we see sometimes 10, 20, 30 seconds go by before the button's pressed, and how they can contribute to that messaging. We teach the recovery position very well, and I think that there is probably an unexplored area in bystander recognition cardiac arrest, and I wonder what role CCTV has to play in that to a degree, and what messaging they can do around that. State Operations Center, you'll see the yellow little badge there, the yellow post-it note. I worked in the control room on a clinical support desk a few years ago, and a crew called for some assistance and said our patient is in cardiac arrest. And a little voice from the dark corner of the control room at 3 a.m. went, I knew that was a CPR. And to me, that was, at the time, a kind of a throwaway statement, but I've reflected on it and went, we had somebody who thought that that was a cardiac arrest case, and because they'd followed the protocol, was fairly happy with their performance. But what did they do about it? And we've really tried to work on what we do in State Operations Center with our call takers. Again, we've given them the why, how they fit into that bigger picture, stuff they probably had very, very little exposure to. We've given them permission to act on intuition and instinct and said, if you really think something's going on, follow your protocol, but let the clinical person in the room know. And pay attention on that bystander CPR quality. If they can do good bystander CPR and swap so that they're not fatigued, this is really what you can do to that picture. Of course, everything's in education and training. What we did is we got a select group of people who you can see on the right there, and they were the small team that delivered training to our paramedics. We realized that we can't change careers' worth of habits in one or 2 hours or one day, and that this was just going to be a repetitive process. But what we needed was constant messaging by people who had absolute buy-in and uncompromising buy-in and understanding of what we wanted to do. So our train the trainer was really in depth, and we wanted them to focus as much on getting paramedics to think about their mindset as much as their skilled delivery, and using instrumented mannequins rather than a Mark I eyeball for CPR quality. And those guys have done us some justice, and that's just for Metro paramedics, but we've got some volunteer trainers that do exactly the same thing. And we know that those guys are probably the experts in our organization. What about the clinicians themselves? Well, we got them involved early in the design of high-performance CPR. We said we want it to be by the people, for the people, because you will peer influence. The why and the science of CPR, again, we just gave as much time to telling them why we wanted them to change and brought them along for the journey. De-emphasizing those early ALS skills, BLS and CPR. But they said, well, what about our paramedic skills? It's the ROSC, that's where you earn your money. We didn't order buy-in. We didn't just simply say that's the algorithm, follow it. We really wanted to just ask them for their buy-in, ask them for their patience, because we knew we'd get a lot of resistance to some things. So we just asked for an open ear and allow us to sell it to them. And the value of leadership was a fairly newish concept for us, and we really asked them to buy into it and have some professional courtesy. And again, the feedback that they gave us, we made the undertaking that we'd listen to them and incorporate that feedback into how we designed it. And the last line there was, we just asked them to justify every pause in CPR. And whenever there was no chest compressions, we wanted them to feel uncomfortable and to challenge their crewmates. So with all of that, are we doing it? Do we think we're doing something better? The role of CCTV, I think, is really good. And I've used this one from Queensland, from Noosa, because it's publicly available, but we're looking at it in Western Australia as often as we can. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to see how that feeds back into learning what our bystanders do, how the recognition is, overlay that with a 000 call, and we're also trying to see what our crews are doing there with a non-punitive intent. And a couple of our paramedics have watched themselves on CCTV, and without any prompting, we just ask them to comment on their performance if they want to, but with absolutely no points highlighted from us. And the feedback we've had has been pretty positive. So I think my end goal is to get CCTV 000 call with AED data, our monitor data, with the audio recording from our monitors to end of job, and see how that looks for a patient journey and how that inspires our people to do better, because we aspire to have survivors. So joining it together is really, really good. And of course, by looking at all of this data and all of this footage, it's really easy to get caught by that punitive trap. And to get people to come along for the journey, we really ask them to be so much more trusting of us that we have non-punitive intent. So in summary, I think improvement is not all about skills, it's about that mindset. Tell your people the why, no matter what level they're at, sell them the science, give them some quality breadcrumbs to eat and follow, create that appetite and sense of optimism, but be upfront and honest with them. And as long as they've got that mindset, they'll come along for the journey and they'll want to do better tomorrow than they did today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for keeping to time. We're going to take a step back and we're going to go to step 9, and I'm going to ask Tony to come back to the stage and talk to us about working towards accountability and submitting out-of-hospital cardiac arrest annual reports to the community. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you very much, Dion. So we talked a bit today about lots of different things, but one of the things I want to talk about now in step 9 is this whole issue around accountability, because at the end of the day, if people don't have a sense of accountability for making improvement, whatever level you are in an organisation, then it's very hard to get the dial shifting at all. Let me kick off with a statement that I firmly believe in, and that is that the measurement of survival to hospital discharge should be expected of all EMS systems. So if you're not reporting and recording publicly, transparently, your cardiac arrest outcomes, then you need to. Because at the end of the day, the community have a right to know how we're going in the sense of people surviving. It's a hard measure and a very benchmarkable measure, and one that we should all be reporting on, acknowledging that we're all at different stages of our journey, but reporting how you're tracking, even if it's a starting point around some level of reporting, is better than none. Because the community, the expectations are high now. So for me, the question I think will be asked of many ambulance services, well, why aren't you reporting your data? Is there something you're hiding? Is it an issue? I'm sure there's not, but that's a question the community will rightly ask, and the media and others will rightly ask, why are you not reporting your outcomes of cardiac arrest? So why publish an annual report? So we published an annual report, and again, unabashedly, you'll see a whole lot of references to Ambulance Victoria's annual report here because I know it. But Karen today and others have put up reference to some work being done by South Australian Ambulance Service, the great work coming out of New Zealand, as well as the work coming out of St John in WA. There are levels of reporting coming out of Queensland, and there are great international reports looking at areas such as London Ambulance Service and the CARES report, which was recently published for last year. But why publish an annual report to the community? Well, one, it does raise your organisational profile. So when you publish your data out to the community, warts and all, this is what we know about cardiac arrest in our community, the community are interested. The community want to know about this issue. The people that support you, your partners in health and across the board, want to know about this. It's a good story to tell, and one of which we tell on an annual basis when we release this report, and it always gets interest. It is always something that people will want to talk to us about. The reality is, this report gets published. It is highly unusual for the Premier of the state not to want to be associated with its report. So you're getting mileage out of this from the people in the community who fund your services. You're showing the value you're adding to the community. So it's not just about response times. Increases accountability. When you publish something, when you put it up there, then you're accountable to it. My KPIs as the CEO of Ambulance Victoria are about improving cardiac arrest outcome. It sits within all of our people in our organisation. It's a statement of priorities that our board signs with the Minister every year. So it's important to us. So therefore so this is really clear about accountability. And Karen identified before, using data out of these reports, we can actually push that down to across our business and say, well, if I live in Ballarat, why are my clinical outcomes not the same as if I live in Bendigo or Melbourne? They should be. They should be. If they're not, why not? And the why nots then help you drive improvement in those local communities to say, well, we need to improve it. What are we going to do differently? It embeds this registry in normal business. I mentioned that already, where you actually use the data out of the registry to improve what you're doing internally as well as externally. It becomes an easy one-stop shop for requests, and it becomes a single point of truth for our consistency of messaging, because I've got to tell you, as the CEO of an organisation, Karen's life and mission is to try and make sure I'm on message about the right things I say, because when you're all of a sudden this figure comes out there and I go, that's right, Karen, and she just sits there and drops her head and hopes no one ever reports it. But the reality is it does provide for consistency of messaging. So you've got the consistent messaging out there around your data and the things that are going on. It allows this conversation to be extended beyond response times. The reality is if you're just publishing response times and that's your clinical outcome measure, you're on a hide into nowhere. Because at the end of the day, you're chasing your tail around response time measures, and the reality is good clinical outcomes require you to compromise response time measures. If I was only being measured on response times, then why would I take people to trauma services? I'd take them to the nearest hospital, dump them off, jump back in the truck and go out and do the next one. Might meet a response time. That's not a quality ambulance service. This is a quality measure. This tells you the number of people who are going back alive with their families at the end of each year. It actually allows you to argue your case within government and with communities about the quality of care you provide. If you don't do that, you're just caught up in all the noise of all these other process measures that become the front page of the local media every day. Allows your performance to be tracked over time. So it does allow you to look at your performance over time and see how you're going. So are you improving? Are you getting better? Or are you plateauing? It actually forces you to actually challenge yourself on those issues. And if you're not having as good a year as you had the year before, why? It might be quite defensible, but why? It forces you to go back and look and say, what are we doing differently? Is something happening in the system that we weren't aware of that we need to change or to think about things differently? It does drive improvement. I'm going to show you a number of figures coming out of our report shortly, but this drives improvement. So I sit there and look at the report and I go, and with the team, and go, well, if I get 64% of people surviving cardiac arrest where they are defibrillated by a defibrillator in local community, for example, how do I systemise that? How do I get the system to actually do that? Because right now, if that's the best outcome I can get, how do we systemise that? Are there ways we can continue to improve CPR? So we've got great CPR rates, but if we look at them across every community, they're not. So they're disadvantaged communities. So what are we going to do in that disadvantaged community to lift it up? So it's that constant sense of driving improvement. What measures gets managed, and at the end of the day, your annual report is the place where you're measured and held to account. And you can celebrate your success. As I mentioned before, we have great case studies coming out of these reports that when we release it, that get lay you odds every single media channel. And social media area will be flush with the stories coming out of this issue. Two great examples, the Premier of the state coming out there talking about the best cardiac arrest survival outcomes in 10 years. Does this do us benefit? Absolutely it does. So it allows us to have a conversation about the value we're adding to the community. It's not just about response times. So I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the report. I'm not going to put in narrative around this. I'm just going to show you some figures coming out of our report, just to give you a sense of the story that we tell. And if you look at the reports coming out of the great work that Bridget and others are doing in St John, New Zealand, Judith and others, and the team in St John, WA, they are very similar approaches to reporting. In fact, we're becoming quite homogenous, I think, in our reporting processes now, which is fantastic. Why? Because each year we look at each other's reports and go, that's really cool, we should do that. So, we're stealing each other. So you're seeing a lot of homogeneity coming into our reports now, which is really good. So what's in them? So you can see there in our reports, basically, we're identifying everyone who suffered a cardiac arrest, a documented cardiac arrest in Victoria, what that means, so people can look at this and know what we mean by Victoria. Victoria actually does mean part of South Australia and New South Wales. It identifies, what the type of patient that we're going to, and whether they had pulse and arrival of EMS. Karen spoke this morning about some of the variation in way, but we're trying to be very transparent by reporting this data. And excluding people who suffer cardiac arrest in a hospital that we might be called to, where they have a brief period of pulselessness. Karen spoke about that this morning. And they're not in cardiac arrest of EMS. So, this is the conversation, Karen. Other services may include that, which therefore would skew it. That's okay, as long as you're very transparent about what you're reporting, so everyone can measure apples and apples. So we look at the incidence and demographics. You can see there the incidence of cardiac arrest in Victoria, age-adjusted incidence of cardiac arrest per 100,000 population. Again, in the setting of paediatrics, adults across all ages and age-adjusted. So we know the crude incidence of cardiac arrest in our state, and it is essentially increasing in some areas. Same principle there. We can see the incidence of cardiac arrest in rural areas versus metropolitan areas. We have a higher incidence of cardiac arrest in our rural regions. If you look at the burden of disease studies, that doesn't surprise us. So therefore, that sense of this principle that we only have a small number in cardiac arrest and in rural Victoria and want to focus on metropolitan or big urban areas, no, it's the opposite. Actually, we're seeing high levels of cardiac arrest outcomes incidence in country Victoria. Again, looking there at Karen mentioned before, we can look at the various regions of the state. So people can look at that. I'm surprised this one never gets any interest, but at the end of the day, you can see there the incidence of cardiac arrest in places like Gippsland is higher than there would be in Melbourne. But that gives you a sense of the difference in incidence across the various regions of the state. And also importantly, the age distribution. So we can see what we're seeing around males and females around age distribution of cardiac arrest. So it's again telling us a really nice story of our community. We can see what causes cardiac arrest, and you can see there the issues that we're facing as the younger, what's driving cardiac arrest, and say someone under 35 years of age, of which trauma and sadly hanging and having a predominant feature. As you're getting older, you can see there that presumed cardiac cause is driving it as people get older. So again, tells you a bit of a story about what type of cardiac arrest you're seeing. This is really important. Freddie talked about this morning, where cardiac arrests occur. So 75% of our cardiac arrests occur at home. So we've rolled out defibrillators across, and I think we're talking public places there, it's around about 14% if I look at it there. So 14% in public places, yet we're rolling out all these defibrillators everywhere. But what about the 75% of people who have a cardiac arrest at home? That's what Good Sam's all about. We look at the system performance. There you can see there response times. So how quickly are we getting to cardiac arrest across our metropolitan and rural regions? And you can see there the majority of our patients are getting responded to within that 6 to 10 minute mark in most cases. Again, CPR rates. How are we going with CPR over time? So we're seeing improvements in CPR coming out across the bystander witnessed and those receiving resuscitation. We can see who survived the event, whether CPR was involved. So we know whether, when people talk about does CPR make a difference, well, yes, it does. We can tell you that story over time. This is my favourite slide, talked about before. So this slide tells you that if I respond an ambulance to a cardiac arrest, then in VF, shockable rhythm, I should say, 48% of ROS gets seen, 26% discharge. If our firefighters and first responders are involved, it's 62% and 33%. If I'm defibrillated by a public access defibrillator, it's 72% and 64%. So that's telling me a really powerful story about the fact that how do I make that the system here in Victoria. And importantly, where we take them is important. So we're measuring all the patient's journey across the system, including their disposition 12 months later. So you can see there we know that people do better when they're transported to PCI-capable hospitals. So as a result of that in our research, we bypass hospitals to take them to PCI-capable hospitals. And if hospitals have problems with that, we say that well, the evidence is saying this is the way we should be doing it. Then we look at outcomes, because that's at the end of the day. These are all process measures, really important measures, but at the end of the day, it's about people going home to their families. So you can see there, survived event there for all EMS treated events. You can see there we've got 25% and 10%, not dissimilar to many other services. You can see there the type of rhythms they're in, and so obviously you do better in shockable rhythm, but you do still not too badly in a PA, I've got to say, which is they're not unsurvivable. You can see there the unadjusted rates of shockable rhythm, 52% ROSC and 32% discharged. And you can see there for those that we witnessed, in other words, patients who arrest in front of a paramedic or volunteer, but largely paramedics in our service, you can see there's 79% ROSC, 64% discharge. That 64% discharge is not that dissimilar to what you get from an AED in the community. So it tells you something about systems of care. And this is a really good one because this is, again, we blatantly borrowed this one from our colleagues in Europe and Wawa had done this as well, I'm almost certain, where we actually said, well, what's the measure per million of population? And that tells me a different story. That tells me a story that we're actually plateaued. Despite the fact that we're seeing year-on-year improvement in cardiac arrest in certain subtypes, we're plateauing. So what's the next big thing we're going to do to jump that? So this is really powerful because otherwise, we're drinking our own bathwater. What's the next big thing we're going to do? And that's what Good Sam is meant to be for us in high-performance CPR, to shift us to the next level. You can see survival over time very quickly for those patients, for overall EMS patients and those that were shockable rhythm. And you can see there that we've got an improving survival. Interestingly, 2017 and 18, you see a drop. It was largely driven by influenza. The number of people who died from the flu back in 2017. I'm really interested to see what this year will do to our cardiac arrest outcomes. And importantly, they're all largely going home. 85% of people are going home being discharged home, then to a private residence. So they're not all end up in nursing homes. When someone says, "Oh, you just bring your patients in, they're all going to nursing homes," they're not. They're going home. And 75% of those, as Freddie said this morning, our data would say are going back to work. If you're working previously, you're back at work. So they're going back to living their lives. And that's the example of that. So again, one of the great things Karen and her team have done is saying it's not just about the patient at the getting them to hospital and 30-day survival. We want to know what they're doing in 12 months' time and how good they're going. And as you can see, that's the disability at 12 months. They're doing pretty well. You know, majority of people are doing pretty well. And it allows you to benchmark, comparing apples and apples. And this is a great example using the data there about how we're tracking against other ambulance services around the world. This is great. The league table is wonderful. We all look at it very carefully. First thing we all look at, and this drives us to try and jump the league table. We're all doing that. And we all want to be Seattle, which is, 56% as we talked about today. And using demographics, big one for us. Big one for us is demographics, about how we can actually tell that story to the community in really using simple tools to enable the community to get a sense of what's happening with cardiac arrest. So these are sitting in our report, and we publish these on our website as well. Again, makes it really clear to people what's going on with cardiac arrest outcomes. So, yes, you should publish an annual report to the community. It allows you to tell the story of cardiac arrest. It drives your improvement. And at the end of the day, the community expects to see that their ambulance services are transparent with the data that tells a story about what's happening to the people they love every day. Thank you.